Yesterday we started out talking about those conditional statements, right? We said a conditional statement was just something that has some hypothesis and a conclusion, right? Some action causes some reaction, right? Something led to something else, okay? Today we're still talking about conditional statements, but we are also going to talk about 3 other ways you can change your conditional statement into something else, and that would be our inverse, converse, and contrapositive, okay? So first, we're just going to start with a conditional statement. So like we just said, this is something happens and it implies something else, right? So if P, then Q, right? Don't write this too big because we are going to write something underneath it, all right? So if P, then Q. So P implies Q. If P happens, then Q happens. All right, so let's look at an example of a conditional. Oh, sorry. We're going to go ahead and define all of these first. So an inverse has that negation that we talked about at the end of the day yesterday, at the end of class yesterday. So remember, to negate something just means to say the word not. Right? So the negation of your conditional would be if not P, then not Q. So your sentence would stay exactly the same. You just insert the word not into both your hypothesis and conclusion. Okay? All right. Then we have our converse. Okay? Your converse says if Q, then P. So it's going to flip your hypothesis and conclusion. So this one, you just added not. This one, you flip the order of your sentence. So where your conclusion was is now going to be your hypothesis, and where your hypothesis was, your conclusion will now be. All right, and then your last type we're going to talk about is our contrapositive. And this one, it's flipped and has the word not in both parts. So it's going to be the same as your converse sentence, just add not into both pieces again. All right? Okay, so now that we know what each of these is asking, let's look at an example of a conditional and see if we can turn it into an inverse, converse, and contrapositive. All right, so let's say that our conditional statement is if it is a rose, then it is a flower. So that's what we're going to start with. If it is a rose, then it is a flower. We know that our hypothesis is it is a rose, right? Because that's right after the word if. And we would know that our conclusion is that it is a flower because it's after the word then. Okay? All right, so now we're going to turn that sentence into an inverse. Remember, this is my nots. Okay? This is our nots. So I'm going to write the exact same sentence but add in not. So how would that sound? Yes. Exactly. If it is not a rose, then it is not a flower. All right. So those are our inverses, just adding in not. Okay. We also are going to look at our converse. Our converse says you flip the places of your hypothesis and conclusion. So I look back at what my conditional was up here in the first box. If it is a rose, then it is a flower. I'm going to flip the green and the black words there. Okay? So my converse should then read, if it is a flower, then it is a rose. So all you do is flip your hypothesis and conclusion. The if and then still stay exactly where they are. All right, and then our contrapositive are our flip nots. So it flips it and has the word not in there. So it's going to be the exact same as our converse, just adding in the nots. So how would our contrapositive read? Exactly. Good job. Okay, so our conditional is what we're used to. If, then, hypothesis first, conclusion second. Inverse, you add in nots. Converse, flips. And contrapositive, flips and nots. Okay? So that's kind of like a little tool that we're going to use to help remember which one is not. So knots, flips, flip knots. Okay. All right, so we have all of our different sentences written down here. So the conditional and contrapositive are related. So the conditional, which is your original, and the contrapositive, the one that's the flip knots, are related. Okay? If one of those is true, then so is the other one. Okay? The inverse and converse, so your knots and your flips, those are related. If one of those is true, then the other is true. And if one of them is false, the other one will automatically be false. What I mean by true and false is we can tell just by reading these statements, some of them make sense and some of them don't, right? Yes, a rose is a type of flower. So that conditional makes sense, right? If it's a rose, then it's a flower, okay? But what about my Converse? If it's a flower, does it have to be a rose? Right, so that's what it means when determining if something is true or not. Okay, so we'll read it. These two are related, and then your conditional and flip knots are going to be related. Whichever one of those is true, the other matches it. All right. Okay. So, how are we supposed to remember which one is which? Okay, so we're about to repeat this a few times here. Okay. Inverse, converse, contrapositive. You say it. Say it. Inverse, converse, contrapositive. Again. Inverse, converse, contrapositive. Say it again. Inverse, converse, contrapositive. One more time. Inverse, converse, contrapositive. Okay. And now we're going to say it with our eyes closed so we don't forget. Here we go. Inverse, converse, contrapositive. All right, now we're going to say knots, flips, flip knots. Okay? Knots, flips, flip knots. Say it again. Knots, flips, flip knots. Good. Now say it with our eyes closed. Knots, flips, flip knots. All right. So, conditional, inverse, converse, contrapositive. Okay? What is inverse? Knots. What's converse? Flips. What's contrapositive? What's inverse? What's converse? And what's contrapositive? All right. Okay. So, let's look at another example of our, fill those in. All right, so let's look at another example where we're going to write the inverse, converse, and contrapositive. So this is example 1 on you guys' paper. Okay, it says if it is a plane, then it contains 3 non-collinear points. That's going to be our conditional statement. So that's our starting point, right? Okay, if I wanted to write the inverse of that statement, what do I need to add in? Knots. Right, so what is that statement going to look like? Very good. If it is not a plane, then it does not contain 3 non-collinear points. Put your phone out. Okay. Then we have our converse. What does converse mean we're going to do? Flip. Right, so we're going to flip the original sentence. So, instead of starting off, it is a plane, it's now going to start off with if it contains 3 non-collinear points, then it is a plane. So, flip the places. Alright, so our inverse was knots, converse is flips, contrapositive is what? Flip knots. Good. So I'm going to flip it and add in the knots. So it should be the same as my converse. I'm just going to add in the knots. Okay? So if there does not exist 3 non-collinear points, then there does not exist a plane. Okay? All right, now we're going to go back and determine the validity of each one of these statements, or is the statement true or false? Okay. So the conditional statement goes with which statement? Which one did we say it went with? What's it going to have the same truth value as? Conditional and contrapositive, right? And my inverse and converse will have the same truth value. Okay? All right, so let's see here. Let's read our contrapositive statement. If there does not exist 3 non-collinear points, then there does not exist a plane, right? And that one's supposed to go with our conditional that says if it is a plane, then it contains 3 non-collinear points. What do we think? True or false? True. Okay, so if one of them's true, the other's true. They go together. Okay, let's read the inverse and converse. Those two go together. So inverse says if it is not a plane, then it does not contain 3 non-collinear points. Converse says if there exists 3 non-collinear points, then there exists a plane. Do those sound true or false? True, right? So in this case, both the conditional and contrapositive were true, as well as the inverse and converse. Okay, so you can mark all of those as true statements there. All right, let's look at another example. So this one, our conditional statement is if a figure is a triangle, then the angle sum is 180 degrees. So first we're going to write our inverse. Okay, what does inverse mean? Not. So I'm going to just add in the not. So how would that sentence read? Good. The figure is not a triangle, then the angle sum is not 180 degrees. Good. All right, so inverse meant to add in the nots. What does converse mean? Flips. All right, so I'm going to flip where it talks about the triangle and where it talks about the angle sum. If and then stay where they are, just switch the hypothesis and conclusion. So what's my converse going to be? Good. If the angle sum is 180, then it's a triangle. Very good. All right, and then we have our contrapositive. So contrapositive is what? Flip knots. So we already flipped it for the converse, so I'm going to pretty much keep it the same as the sentence above. I just need to add in the knots, right? So this one would read as what? What do you think? What's the contrapositive going to sound like? Perfect. Keep it the same as your converse, just add in the knots. Very good. All right, so now that we have all of our statements, they said we need to tell whether those statements are true or false. So remember, our conditional and contrapositive go together, so they're going to have the same truth value as our inverse and converse. Okay. All right, so let's start with that conditional and contrapositive. If a figure is a triangle, then the angle sum is 180. If the angle sum is not 180, then the figure is not a triangle. What do we think? True or false? Yeah, right? An angle sum for a triangle is 180 degrees. Good. All right, then we have inverse and converse. Okay. This says if a figure is not a triangle, then the angle sum is not 180 degrees. Converse says if the angle sum is 180 degrees, then a figure is a triangle. So a figure could be anything, right? So what do we think? True or false on those? False, right? If I have a straight line, that's a figure, and it's 180 degrees, but is a straight line a triangle? No. Okay. So, in this case, our conditional and contrapositive were true, but our inverse and converse ended up being false. Because although, yes, a triangle is 180 degrees, there are other figures that can also be 180 degrees. All right. Okay, in the next section of examples, oops, I kind of gave one away already. It says determine whether each statement is true or false, then write the converse and tell if it is true or false, then write the contrapositive. Okay, so number 3 says if x equals 9, then x equals, oh sorry, that's supposed to say x squared. My square moved down here for some reason. If x squared equals 9, then x equals -3. What do we think? True or false? It could be true. Is that the only possible outcome? No, because it could also be what? Positive. Okay. All right. Then they did ask us to write the converse, right? Okay. So converse means I'm going to write what? Converse, what does that one mean? Flips, right? So I'm going to flip the order here. So then when I rewrite it, it's now if x equals -3, then x squared equals 9. What about that? Is that true? Yeah, right? If x is -3 and I square it, I am going to get 9. So that one would be true, right? Okay. All right, and then we are also supposed to write the contrapositive, and the inverse. So the inverse would mean not, right? So really it would be the same as the original, just adding in the word not, right? So it would be exactly what we had here, but basically that, right? If x squared does not equal 9, then x does not equal -3. All right, and then our contrapositive would be the same as what's in the red, but it would also need the not, right? So I don't really have to rewrite anything, just say it's not equal, right? Okay. All right, so then we already said the original statement, x squared equaled 9, then x equals -3 was false, right? So that would mean the contrapositive would also be false, right? Because they go together. We said that the converse, x equals -3, then x squared equals 9 was true. So that would mean our inverse would also be true because they go together. Okay. All right. So let's see here. Number 4 says if the measure of my angles moved too. If the measure of angle A equals 60. Then angle A is not obtuse. What do we think? True or false? Right. Doesn't mean it's obtuse, right? Because it has to be what to be obtuse? More than 90. Good. All right. So then I need to write the converse. So converse means we're going to do what? Flip it. All right. So then it would read, oh, it's because I wrote on the screen. Let's see. Yeah, now it just wants to let me write. Let's see here. Can I? There it is. If the measure of angle A is not obtuse, then the measure of angle A equals 60. Okay? So we just flipped their order. Okay, what do we think about that one? True or false? False, right? It doesn't have to be 60 just because it's not obtuse, right? So we've already also determined what the true and false will be for our inverse and contrapositive because they should match these originals, right? Okay, our inverse just means the nots, right? So here, this would actually be if the measure of angle A is not 60, then the measure of angle A is not obtuse. Well, 2 knots really would just turn it into a positive, right? Okay, and then for my measure of angle A is not obtuse, then the measure of angle A is equal to 60. We would add our knots into there as well, right? Okay. Number 5 says if Beth lives in Dallas, then she lives in Texas. True or false? What do we think? It's true. Okay. If I was to write the converse, what am I going to do to that sentence? Flip it, right? So then it's going to say, if Beth lives in Texas, then she lives in Dallas. Is that true? No. Right? And then for inverse and contrapositive, we just need to go and add in the nots. Okay. All right, number 6 says if A is greater than 2, then 3A is greater than 6. What do we think, true or false? True, right? If this is anything bigger than 2, if I go plug it in over there, that's going to end up being greater than 6 because I'm multiplying it by 3. Good. And then if I write the converse, what am I going to do? Flip it. So then it would read, if 3A is greater than 6, then A is greater than 2. Would that be true or false? True, right? We would just basically solve to check the validity, divide by 3. We actually get exactly what we would have written over there, right? Okay, good deal. All right, so now, somewhere on your paper, maybe there at the bottom or in the margin or maybe at the top, I want you to create 2 conditional statements. One of the statements needs to have a true converse. So converse means we're going to do what to it? Flip it. So you need to write the conditional, and whenever you flip it, it needs to be true. Okay? And then the other statement, I want to have a false converse. So that would mean whenever you flip it, it's not true anymore. Okay? And then you're going to trade your statements with a partner. Okay? Once you and your partner trade papers, your partner will then write the inverse, converse, and contrapositive for your statements. Okay? So first, just write 2 conditional statements that has one true and one false converse. Okay, so let's start there, and then we'll finish the activity. Okay, so I'm going to give you a second to write your 2 conditional statements with one true and one false conditional statement. So go ahead and do that.